radiocarbon insights. New radiocarbon insights into Pawnee ethnogenesis. And this is based off of my dissertation data. And so this is all available online through my dissertation on ProQuest, and some articles are going to be coming about it. So with more data. But here's basically the gist. So tonight, I know this is going to seem like a lot, but we'll be able to get through it in 40 minutes, I promised. Just a real quick about me, brief overview of Indigenous archaeologies, some content background, research questions, the oral traditions that we're going to be investigating, and the archaeological record that we're teasing apart, and then followed by some Bayesian modeling and the results. So like a lot that is going into this research, multiple lines of evidence to garner greater interpretations into the archaeological record in the Central Plains. And so just quick about me, Jillian did a great job. So I'm currently at the University of Kansas. I'm the curator of archaeology for the Biodiversity Institute and Natural History Museum, while also an assistant professor of anthropology. I've been at KU since the spring of 2024, and I'm an affiliate faculty in museum studies and Indigenous studies. Great Plains archaeology is my jam, and we'll get into why that is here in a second. And radiocarbon chronology is really the specialization within archaeology that I have pursued, because without having control of time, there's not much we can do in terms of accurate archaeological interpretations of the record. And then this is all through an approach in Indigenous archaeologies, which I'll discuss in a bit. And this kind of side gig I do is the dispersal of European horses. Some work that I've been engaged with some folks out in Colorado, looking at European horses into North Americas. And I do want to let you guys know that I am clearly doing this from home. I have a cat. It is around dinner time, so she's going to be a little chatty. In addition to, she might make a couple of appearances, letting me know that she is not super stoked about dinner being late. So what drives my scholarship and teaching and curation and outreach? Like, why am I doing all of this? And a lot of this deals with three main threads. One, looking at Indigenous history, specifically Pawnee history, beyond a European record, entwined with defragmenting the archaeological record, and doing so through developing an Indigenous history or Pawnee history within archaeological science and Indigenous knowledge. And so what I mean by the defragmenting the archaeological record, really trying to tease apart all of the archaeology alphabet soup that we've created and the taxonomies and a lot of this ivory tower language that we've used to understand the past in meaningful ways, but not so for the everyday member of the public or a tribal citizen can understand readily. And so with these three things, is just trying to make the archaeological record not only make more sense, but also do so in collaboration with Indigenous partnership. And so what is Indigenous archaeologies? What is this methodology that I've hinted at? Well, there's a couple definitions. Two of the most prominent Indigenous archaeologists or archaeologists that have advocated for this approach are George Nicholas, as well as Joe Watkins. And Nicholas has a couple definitions, and my favorite really being the Nicholas and Andrew 1997 definition that Indigenous archaeology is with, by, and for Indigenous people. And so really illustrating that Indigenous archaeologies are a collaborative, community-based approach in archaeology. These sorts of approaches in archaeology have been on the rise since the 1990s. This is nothing new, but it's really just keeping Indigenous populations, specifically in a government-to-government relationship, involved from the onset of a project and being part of project development, planning, all the way to completion. That's all it is. Nothing too crazy. So who can practice Indigenous archaeologies? It's not just Indigenous people, it is anybody. As long as you're doing an archaeology for, by, and with Indigenous populations in a collaborative model, anyone can be someone practicing an Indigenous archaeological approach. So, and more importantly, the reason why I call it Indigenous archaeology is pluralizing the archaeology part, is that it's not a one-size-fits-all model. That like the way that I do archaeology as a Pawnee citizen is very different than how a citizen of who is Dene would do their archaeology, or someone who's Seminole that would do theirs. That my approach into this framework is very much rooted in Pawnee epistemologies, interwoven with the archaeological science. So, and just being an Indigenous person or being an Indigenous anthropologist, practicing Indigenous archaeology, all it is bridging together the Indigenous knowledge with anthropological and museum sciences. So it's just bringing those things together and connecting them. I'm not saying one is greater or more relevant than the other. Just using them as multiple lines of evidence to understand the archaeological record. Really trying to like hit upon that Indigenous approaches, collaborating with Indigenous communities is not something that is adversarial to archaeological science. These are very much approaches that make more fuller interpretations of the record and provide more richer research questions and create more meaningful collaborationships and partnerships. And so finally getting into some archaeology, where we're going to be looking at today through this talk is we're going to be looking at three different periods within the archaeological record, really within the past 2,000 years, 1,500 years, going from the late woodland period through the Plains Village and into contact and colonial. And so the region that we're looking at today is the Central Plains. And what is the Central Plains? It is basically the states of Nebraska and Kansas, plus the Front Range of Colorado and eastern Wyoming. It is from the Missouri River to the east to the Rocky Mountain Front Range in the west. And this, of course, is the traditional homeland of the Pawnee Nation and the Arikara Nations, as well as the Wichita affiliated tribes, right? So here's the Central Plains here. You can see it's pretty much Pawnee. And here I am at the University of Kansas. And the Arikara and Wichita, why I look at them is because, you know, we're part of the same linguistic family. We're part of the Northern Caddoan language family. The Arikara are northern cousins, and the Wichita being our southern cousins. We've maintained those contacts and relationships through time. That even when it came to trying to understand the difference between the Pawnee and the Arikara, Lakotas and other northern horse nomads had a hard time differentiating us and often would just refer to us by the same name. Wichitas are a little bit weirder. They're kind of like our southern cousins in their grass houses, but still like South Band Pawnees have continued relationships with the Wichita throughout a tradition known as Kuskahadu or visitation that has been an unbroken tradition for the past couple hundred years. And so the Pawnee historically meaning, and what I mean by historically putting in air quotes, is talking about the Pawnee at the time of contact. And that is the Pawnee are a federation of four bands or four subgroups. You have the Skeety, Kikahaki, Pitahawidata, and Chawi. The latter three, Kikahaki, Pitahawidata, and Chawi, these are the South bands. These are made up of 1 to 2 towns each, whereas the Skeety is a confederacy of clans. And each clan had its own town sometimes too. So it is a much larger political entity that operates differently socially from the South Bands, and that we can see that in some of our oral traditions, oral stories, and some of our behaviors. So really, when you look at the Pawnee Nation today, it's made up of 4 subgroups, but really 2 distinct tribes make the Pawnee Nation today. And of course, the bringing together of this as one political entity is very much a late 19th century US induced amalgamation. So the Skeety, this is what I am. I am from the Pahukstatu Akitaru, or the Pumpkin Vine clan of the Skeety band of the Pawnee Nation. We're the ones with the star chart. This is an image from the Chicago Field Museum, which the Pawnee Nation has trademark over, as well as we are the only group of Indigenous people north of Mexico who had practiced ritual human sacrifice. And for those of you that might remember the early 90s, known for Wes Studi playing a Pawnee and Dances with Wolves back in the day. And when it comes to our cultural landscape as Pawnee people, very, very much centered in the Central Plains, really tying that back in that even though that map I showed you earlier of 1650s showed tribes on either side of us, our cultural landscape, our markers went from the Missouri River in the east to the west. And we can see especially some Western landscape geographic are just locations within our cosmology, such as Pawnee Buttes, Pikes Peak, which is sometimes referred to as mountain that touches the sky, and Spanish Peaks. So like we are very much within the Colorado Front Range. And there I am again at the University of Kansas. So the tribal territories themselves, though, so this map is something I produced for the dissertation. The dotted line is an approximate boundary of northern Caddoan, ancestral northern Caddoan speakers, the Arikara, Wichita, and the Kichai, in 1650, and then the solid line is where we were approximately in the 19th century. And the reason being that our territory shrunk is we see these tribes here, the Ponca Omaha, and others in 1650 to the east. In the 19th century, like 1800s, we see the Arapaho, Kiowa, Comanche, and these other groups come in. And what is effectively happening is Apaches are coming down from the north. We have the Cheyenne, Lakotas, they're being kicked out of the woodlands by the Potawatomis and Chippewas in Minnesota, and they're moving across the Missouri River and into the Rocky Mountain Front Range. And in addition to, we have Comanches who are breaking off from the Shoshone proper and moving down to southern Texas. And so, what a lot of these traditional horse nomads that many people think of as Plains Indians are really occupying the Western Plains and only able to do so because of horse nomadism. Where prior to that, living in the high plains or the short grass prairie was difficult because there's just doesn't have as long a growing season. And so my research questions going into this, now that we've established, what I do, why I do it, and where I work, really coming out of a lot of these Bayesian models and some reanalysis of radiocarbon dating is really I had this question of like, what is the radiocarbon library for the Central Plains region? Like, what is it looking like? How has it been investigated in the past? How do we know which data sets are good? And then, if the data set needs to be pruned up, how does this change our understanding of the appearance of maize farming and social transformations? And I want you to think about that maize farming. We'll get to why that's important here in a moment. And more importantly, it was just like, what do the Pawnee and Arikara oral traditions have to say about the archaeological record, if and when the radiocarbon data set has been reinvestigated? So that's what I was looking at, was really just, hey, how do we know what we know about radiocarbon data in the Central Plains? Because when people think cutting edge research, the Great Plains doesn't always come to mind. And so that's what I was really focused on, is like, well, what's going on in the Great Plains? So what are the Pawnee oral traditions themselves? What do they say about not only where we've been on the landscape, but how can we use some of these oral traditions in understanding and building a relative chronology that we can sync with the archaeological record? And so this is a very brief, to say the least, presentation of some of our oral traditions. So these are coming from the Pawnee, Arikara, and Wichita. So all three of these tribes, these nations, talk about coming somewhere from the southwest, somewhere in the land of the stone houses. Where that is, we do not know. But what does happen is that there's an eastward migration from the southwest, and at the cross of the Big Timbers in Oklahoma, ancestral Arikara populations, they split off and they occupied the upper Republican River Valley in northern Kansas and southern Nebraska, while the rest of the groups, the Skeety, the South Bends, and the Wichita, travel east until they hit the Mississippi River. From there, where the Arikara are hanging out in northern Kansas, southern Nebraska, the other three ancestral northern Caddoan groups move northward along the Mississippi, but somewhere before reaching the Missouri River, ancestral Skeety populations end up traveling to the same upper Republican River Valley to meet up with the Arikaras. They're living together. And then Arikaras end up moving a little bit further north into northeastern Kansas, or sorry, northeastern Nebraska, my apologies. Upon hitting the crossings or the intersections of the Mississippi and Missouri, these ancestral South Bend and Wichita populations travel along the Missouri River, where they too end up reaching the upper Republican River Valley. The Skeeties end up going to central Nebraska, and then and then ancestral Arikaras end up pushing them, relocating to southeastern South Dakota along the Missouri River. And these become very much typical homelands for these groups that persist into European contact. And then, of course, eventually the Arikaras end up just traveling further north in the Missouri River, but that's during colonization times. And the Wichita, this is the only time that I saw differences in the oral traditions. Some Wichita oral traditions talked about getting to the upper Republican River Valley and realizing it wasn't for them, they went back to Oklahoma. Others say they stayed with the South Band Pawnees and then went to Oklahoma. Both of these things can be true, right? Because not one tradition speaks for all Wichitas. The Wichitas are today are made up of many different tribes. And so what we can just be seeing are just differences of experiences by subgroups. But the end result is the same. They do end up go to Kansas and Nebraska with the South Band Pawnees, but they split off south going to Oklahoma and Texas. And so when I said earlier, keep a mention of corn. Corn is incredibly important in our culture. Mother corn are very much those indigenous folks that were very well entrenched in the mother corn package. And so farming is an essential part of corn agriculture. And so how do we end up and where are the Pawnees in time archaeologically from, the 6th century CE, where everyone in the Central Plains is basically hunting and gathering. This is at the end of Kansas City Hopewell, which doesn't get too much in the Central Plains, but it's around. But everyone's pretty much hunting and gathering in this what we call late woodland period. But by the 16th century, in 1,000 years, we have full-blown maize agriculture. We have large towns. They're not villages. These are towns of thousands of people. And socially stratified societies with ceremonial dedicated ceremonial spaces as well as plazas. So where do the Pawnees fit into this? Have they always been there? How does this work with the oral traditions? Can we track this movement around Oklahoma and the Missouri, Mississippi? Where do the Pawnees fit into this archaeological timeline? And so looking at the oral traditions, we can build a relative chronology of Pawnee history. And so our oral traditions, many of them have been saved through song and ceremony. And when you start piecing them together, you can really isolate important key events in these oral traditions to develop a before and after sequence. And what was developed is the most important part of Pawnee society is corn. Corn is one of the oldest stories that we have. Following corn is earth lodges and towns. Following that is horses. Following that is Spanish, and then the Lakotas. And for some of you guys be like, wait, how do we get horses before the Spanish, and how do we get the Spanish before Lakotas? And we'll talk about that a little bit. But corn, like archaeologically, we can see this, right? We can look at corn cobs that are archaeologically visible. When we look at earth lodges and towns, we can look at the settlement patterns, post holes, look for these structures in the archaeological record. When it comes to horses, we can look at horse remains and more specifically looking at wear patterns of horse skeletons to identify what kind of riding tack was used to identify if they're European or indigenous. And when it comes to the Spanish, we can look at the Villaseñor expedition or the Coronado. Some of these others where the Spanish came to the Great Plains, and then the Lakotas, they come later. So when we're re-looking at this chronology, sorry, I didn't mean to have those transitions there. For the purposes of tonight's talk, this is what we're really isolating on is corn and earth lodges and towns, right? Because corn is so pivotal, and we're looking at that transition between the archaeological record, between these hunting and gathering groups to full-blown maize agriculturalists. Corn and earth lodge towns, these are archaeologically visible. These can be tested very easily with radiocarbon sampling. And so looking at corn traditions themselves, interestingly, we get two stories. The Skeety, they talk about getting corn in Nebraska, that they're already present in Nebraska. They get corn specifically near Beaver Creek. And it is brought there from the north, whereas the South Band, they actually talk about how they, at the meeting of the Missouri and Mississippi, they already have corn and they plant it along the way as they migrate into Nebraska and Kansas. Those are two very different stories. And once again, kind of tying back to this Pawnee background, the Skeety and South Bands are really two different tribes, right? And so it would make sense that we do have two very different versions of events going on. And maybe for, you guys are in Arkansas, very familiar with some of these Mississippian archaeologies. There might be some bells ringing in your heads. We'll get to that later. And so this is pretty important specifically with the Skeety oral tradition because it's very specific as to a place, right? And when a record gives you a place where you can expect something, that's when you can narrow down your archaeological investigation. And so, who are we looking at when it comes to the record here, right? So, we have some oral traditions. We talk about population movement. We're looking at maize, and who do we isolate, or what archaeological taxa can we isolate and for this investigation and tying Pawnees to the record? So, with our hunting and gathering groups, we have the late woodland period, horticulturalists, we have the Central Plains tradition, Central Plains Oneota, and Great Oasis, and then followed by, and then we have this thing called Pomona variant. It's kind of this weird. I wouldn't say weird. One moment, sorry. Talking a lot. The Pomona variant is a very interesting archaeological culture that isn't quite doing horticulture, but they aren't quite hunter-gatherers. They're kind of not totally bought into the system. We're not quite sure where they fit. And then lastly, we have the agriculturalists, this being initial coalescent variant, extended coalescent variant, and the lower lote phase, which is a phase of the extended coalescent variant. When it comes to hunter-gatherers, the archaeological record is this is when we're really starting to see pottery after the Kansas City Hopewell. They're very the pots are not very decorated. They're very conical. The projectile points are corner notched. And the big difference is there's like 12 different phases. I'm not a huge fan of phases, and we don't apply them under the Midwest taxonomic system like they should be, or even Wiley and Phillips. The Great Plains taxonomy is a little weird. But the two big differences in the woodland components is in the South, you have cemeteries, and really in Nebraska, you have ossuaries. And how you treat your dead is a very, very big indicator as to afterlife and therefore identity. So those are the two big differences. Um, and then we have this Pomona variant out here to the east. It's in eastern Kansas. We're not quite sure what's going on. And that's about 950 to 1350. So a bit later in time. Our horticulturalists, we're looking at Great Oasis, about 900 to 1100. They're very quick flash in the pan, mostly known for being in Northwest Iowa, but we do have Great Oasis components in Nebraska. Until this research, they've never been dated, and we will get to that. Great Oasis have rectangular houses, flared rims. Rims are decorated, and once again, house structures are very much an indicator as to identity. Then we have the Central Plains tradition. This is all along northern Kansas, Nebraska. The heartland is, of course, parts of the east and central parts of these two states. But we do have campsites all in eastern Colorado and eastern Wyoming. And more importantly, it was understood the Central Plains tradition started in the southeast in northeastern, or sorry, in the southeast Nebraska, northeast Kansas, along the Missouri River with Steve Kisker phase, and expanded outward along the Missouri River and Republican River valleys into the rest of the Central Plains. These houses are not rectangular, they're square with four main center posts. Probably wattle and dove. We're not entirely sure what these are constructed of. And we're talking about side notch points, sometimes basally notched, globular pots, decorated rims, usually braced rims. We also have beveled knives. We have fishing hooks. We have pipes. Much more diverse archaeological assemblages across this region for this time, and traditionally understood to be about 950 to 1450, which would make it contemporaneous with Great Oasis. And then we have Central Plains Oneota, and we know these folks are coming in from elsewhere. So Oneota, of course, is really well known in Wisconsin. Oneota populations cross Iowa and they get into eastern Nebraska, and then also north central Kansas, south central Nebraska. They're only here for a flash in the pan as well, just 200 years, really at the tail end or end of the medieval global warming period. Not much is known about the components in north central Kansas. Lauren Ritterbush and Brad Logan are working on that. And these pots, flared rims, Oneota pottery is very well, unique, very well known. And these are also rectangular houses. The arrowheads are mostly triangular. And then moving on to our agriculturalists. And I know we're really just marching through time here. And in terms of our agriculturalists, now that we're moving away from the horticulturalists, the initial coalescent variant really begins along the Missouri River, 13 to 1500. And funnily enough, initial coalescent variant, this is just a large, in the stumbling so bad, I apologize. The image from Google Maps to the southeast is a site I was working on in my dissertation with Dr. Douglas Banforth and Dr. Kristen Carlson. The site is over a mile long, and it is comprised of a town of Central Plains tradition houses, primarily Central Plains tradition components. However, we do see Oneota pottery that is locally made in this region. Um, Interpret that how you will, but it's primarily Central Plains tradition. Extended coalescent variant is just an extension of initial, but this is where we start seeing true earth lodges, very much Pawnee and Arikara. Extended coalescent variant is well known for being ancestral Arikara, and we're talking about large earth lodge towns that are palisaded and defended. Um, and this is really towards the end. And then lower loop phase, which is a phase of the extended coalescent variant, and that is, and pre-contact, right at contact, ancestral Pawnee. So we really see, at the very least, through the record, a clear connection between the Central Plains tradition through initial coalescent to extended coalescent variant. That Central Plains tradition really does seem to represent ancestral northern Caddoan populations, specifically the Pawnee and Arikara. The relationship to the Wichita is still up in the air. So where do the oral traditions tie in, right? Like we're talking about corn, we talked about migration, how does this all fit? And this is how we start getting to the radiocarbon dates, right? And so for radiocarbon data, what is it? I mean, radiocarbon dating, right? The sun emits cosmic radiation. Nitrogen 14 is part of this. It kicks out this is where I always get bummed up, and it's late in the day. But through a process, nitrogen 14, there's a neutron capture, which is get carbon 14. The biggest thing about this is that carbon 14 has a half-life of over 5,730 years, which means we can date anything within 50,000 years ago. But most importantly, the proportion of carbon 14 is not consistent through time, and that's how we're able to date it. But with that, it's not consistent, but it's also not a perfect linear regression, meaning we can't identify the exact calendar age. So sometimes there's plateaus, and we do have plateaus in this region, what we call radiocarbon plateau. And this brings into that whole question at the beginning of like, what does our radiocarbon data set look like before we can start investigating some of these oral traditions? And so it gets into what can we radiocarbon date, right? One is being corn. We also can do food residue from pottery vessels, bark, structural timbers, and of course, charcoal. Charcoal's always being the biggest one. For the Central Plains data sets, we also were identifying what we can't radiocarbon date. And early on in the 90s was Donald Blakesley at Wichita State University, who's been talking about Etsanoa for a long time now. There's a period of dates from the Gakushin Library and Laboratory in Japan. Don't use those dates. They were smoking cigarettes while doing radiocarbon, and guess what? It messed up radiocarbon dates. Second is juniper. Juniper is a long-lived tree species, so it is very susceptible to the old wood problem. And then mussel shell, because that is produces a reservoir effect of carbon and produces bad dates. And then Donna Roper back in 2014, she really introduced this idea of identifying confidence levels. What are the dates that you want to be running in your archaeological analysis? And really short-lived species is the big one. That's where corn, seeds, nuts, grass, or bone come into, because bison don't live super long on the plains. Corn especially is critical because, it's only a seed for so long, or it's only a cob for so long, that you're reducing the offset of the target event or the human behavior you're trying to radiocarbon date in the actual age of the sample itself. And I expanded upon this, realizing going through, modern archaeological, like radiocarbon sampling and hygiene, along with these modern applications in Bayesian statistical modeling, expanding what Donna and Donald had done before, and adding a couple things. But one is these unidentifiable lumps of charcoal. These are not great. We have an old wood problem on the plains. And more importantly, we don't want to just throw these out, even though they have a low confidence level. Under Oxcal, we can create charcoal outlier models, so they can still be incorporated. But more importantly, some of the introduction, some things that I added are samples with non-normalized age distributions. This was a big one, and realizing that many radiocarbon data sets basically dates that were run pre-1989 in the Great Plains. Their samples were not normalized, and therefore they are unreliable and have to be kicked out of data sets. And that changed a lot. Um, this is one I always get comments about, especially in the new NACP regulations. There's two ways we can go about it. One, we can say, hey, you shouldn't be using data on dead Indians without living Indians' permission because of ethical and moral reasons. The second one is, hey, these were also populations that were eating a lot of mussels, and their diet of those mussels actually can create bad radiocarbon age estimates because they weren't corrected. I'll let you guys pick. For a Central Plains data set, you can either take the high road and say it's unethical, or you can just, be very blunt and say, well, the dates are probably bad anyways, they shouldn't be used. So I give people that choice. When running all this data, I looked at 852 radiocarbon dates, which isn't that much to be honest, but that's like the best we have for the Great Plains. Looked at those 9 archaeological texts that we talked about, and I made 31 statistical models. In addition to this, and we'll get to why I made so many models here in a second, was also creation of new data. So I ran over 50 new radiocarbon dates. Donna Roper, back before she passed away, her and Mary Adair had been working in the early 2010s on new radiocarbon dates, specifically in Kansas, but the Nebraska data set had been left alone. And so what I really focused on was expanding what we knew about Nebraska dates. And so that was targeting different archaeological taxa and sites within Nebraska to supplement the AMS dates that had been taken within the same decade in Kansas to really get a fuller picture of some of these archaeological cultures. And so one, like completely offering new data sets to Northeast Nebraska, which was virtually a ghost town of radiocarbon dates. We knew sites existed there. We didn't know what age. But more importantly, remember that Pawnee oral tradition, the Skeety one about where they found corn or where it should have, the first place we had it? Well, that allowed us to identify the Beaver Creek drainage and start looking in the gray literature and looking for sites that had corn. And then we found a site that had corn that was Great Oasis that was less than like 10 miles away from where the Pawnee said we got corn. And then we just dated it. So that was like a very easy use of indigenous oral traditions of like, why don't we look in the places where the Indians said things important happened? And that's what we did. And so this data set, like this data was just hanging out already in it was either Nebraska Historical Society or the State Archaeology Office, but it was a assemblage that hadn't been looked like in decades. These are all the sites that I got new dates on. Some of these dates, part of my research question of like trying to understand if there was an old wood problem, why I got so many dates. One, I was trying to identify assemblages that had been dated before, but two, I had this whole idea of like, well, why don't we just check out, see if we do have an old wood problem. So I dated sites for the first time, but then I also dated sites that had only been dated through unaffiliated radio like charcoal dates from the 80s, and I wanted to see if there was an offset. And so that's what I did. So one was just identifying old wood. So really looking out, oh, I messed up a transition. There should be something highlighting here. This is, oh, there it is. So this is 25 RH70. This is the Rulo site. And so you can see I dated all the UCI dates are mine. I use Irvine because like I can just send Sutton 50 radiocarbon dates and he'll get it done. So that's why I'm a huge proponent of that lab because I can send them buckets of dates that are relatively cheaper than some other places. And what you can see even from dating the same site, the same component, my dates were one more consistent and they were tighter. And you can see some of these wood charcoal dates, like the OS dates and the Texas dates, were all over the place, and some of them were anomalously old. So this is just one example, but like pretty much all the sites I got AMS dates on, specifically bison bone in the same context as the wood charcoal dates, they all showed up closer to us in time. So really showing and it turned out that the dates that I was running them against, like those charcoal dates, were non-normalized. It was just kind of a mess, and we'll get into that. And using Bayesian, Bayesian is awesome. And it really does take a specialist to really use, Oxcal to its fullest extent. There is an issue we're starting to see in the archaeological literature where people are using Bayesian without really understanding the parameters and getting some wonky stuff happening. And so specifically with the model construction, but I do not want to go down that path. But anyways, there's Thomas Bayes. He's awesome. There's his theorem, also awesome. And so what we're seeing with these radiocarbon dates, so this is 25HW6, and this is, using the boundary function to identify the start and end boundaries of a site, being able to look at the radiocarbon data sets, overcome radiocarbon plateaus and identify, when site started. We can look at this Kufel site, 25HW6. We can see the boundary start, which is, roughly between 1150, 1200. And then it adds into these back end dates to identify this end date. Same with the site is ending really around 1300, right? So just the power of Bayesian statistics in this modeling is just incredible. And through this, I was able to not only look at the age ranges of sites, but then also entire archaeological taxa under this new protocol, under this new hygiene data set of really understanding the radiocarbon dates and getting rid of a lot of dates that were unusable for constructing chronologies, like they just had to be tossed. So this is where we uses 852 radiocarbon dates, the taxa, and the 31 Bayesian statistical models. When you make the models, I really looked at 4 radiocarbon data sets, like just looking at those time periods we talked about at the beginning, late woodland, early plains village. I also looked at the Central Plains tradition because that thing was such a huge data set, needed to be broken down because it has multiple phases, and then late plains village data set. Each data set I ran under 4 different criteria to really understand how we were getting some of these age ranges and what it looked like when we excluded some dates and used different parameters. And so I had 4 models. Model A is basically every radiocarbon date that was used in the past, minus the ones that automatically disqualified. So this is how the vast majority of archaeological chronologies have been developed in Central Plains, in Great Plains archaeology. Then model B, this is just excluding those non-normalized age distributions. So this is how radiocarbon dates should have been run since 1987, and they hadn't been in the Great Plains. Model C, this is an investigation of Roper. One of Roper 2014's conclusions was get rid of all charcoal dates. And then I also did Model D, which is incorporating a Bayesian outlier model, charcoal outlier model. And this is really the best practice since 2009. And really just to go out and say, like, Roper wasn't wrong, but what Donna hadn't realized was the dates that she were really messing up her data were those non-normalized dates, not necessarily the charcoal being the problem itself. Part of this, like this is just the Central Plains tradition data set. The Central Plains tradition is made up of 7 phases. Yes, there are 8 things here. Glenwood is in Iowa. It's its own little thing, and I wanted to separate from the data set. What really became a problem is when you start hygienating the dates, your sample sizes just drop drastically. Like if you look under row C, like Solomon River here in Kansas doesn't have a single AMS date. They were all wood charcoal. So when you did the Donna Roper approach of just getting rid of wood charcoal, you lost an entire river valley of occupation. Alarming. And even still, when you kept it, we only had 13 dates. I think it's just, I'm understanding the Solomon River stuff is in the Smithsonian. I'm working on getting it so I can date it. New NAGPRA regs, throwing a wrench into things. Where am I at with time? Jillian, how are we doing? Oh wow, I am close. I am so sorry, everybody. Let's speed run this. Um, that's a lot of dates. These are pretty close. The outlier model, and it turned out the outlier model and model B just turned out really similar. But anyways, new timeline. Let me get to the good stuff here. Key takeaways. So the new timeline, my bad. Part of this was just showing how occupations in the Central Plains have been talked about through time. So I created this fun little table of like how in the literature these timelines have been reported. And when you do this Bayesian approach, when you hygiene the dates, you understand the data set, all those charcoal dates that are non-normalized or on old wood always end up being the earliest dates. And so when you get rid of them or correct them, the end dates of chronologies don't change because those were always being weighted really by AMS dates and good dates. The beginnings or starts of archaeological phases, archaeological taxa change. They start later in time, closer to us. So what happened um, was two things. One, the early Plains Village period, like the horticulturalists, that horticultural period was super quick. Rather than the Central Plains tradition starting in 950 and beginning in where is it? Um, under this old idea of the Central Plains tradition specifically, old timeline 950 CE to 1450, and it developed in the south in northeastern Kansas, southeastern Nebraska with that Steve Kisker area, and it came in from the Missouri River. That's what they were saying. And it matched with that South Band oral tradition, right, of coming into the Missouri River. But archaeologically, no one seemed to be like, well, in Missouri, there should be some Central Plains tradition folks, right? But there was no Central Plains components that we could track. So this is where it was stemming from. Those were the earliest dates. And when you look at the literature, right, Steve Kisker was part of the Missouri River Dam Project. It was some of the earliest sites that were dug, and all those dates were from like prior to the 80s and non-normalized, and we had to get rid of them. And this is what it looked like, right? That Central Plains tradition was moving along the Upper Republican Missouri River drainages and into the loop. With the new dates, we pushed back Central Plains tradition starting to 1100. More importantly, it started in central Nebraska with some of the earliest corn dates. And the first Central Plains tradition site that we dated um, was less than 10 miles away from that Great Oasis site that had corn. So there's some connection. And if there's a question about it later, I'll explain the Great Oasis potential connection through oral traditions. But this really upended what we understood about the appearance of maize horticulture and then agriculture into the Central Plains. It was a local development from late woodland folks, getting corn from Great Oasis in some way, shape, or form and developing it locally, and then it spread out. So then we're saying Central Plains tradition. It is a local adaptation that is specific to Nebraska that gets into Kansas. Thank you. That was a lot. I went over 40 minutes. I apologize, everybody. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you so much for letting me speak to you guys tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much. Don't apologize for going over. That was a lot of content to get through. And we appreciate you taking the time to explain it to us. So we've got a Q&A section in the chat too. Mel Zabecki, state archaeologist of Arkansas, said it was great with three exclamation points. Woo!
Well, thank you.
And then Alex Barker, he's the director of the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. I don't know if you can see this question and answer
Oh yeah,
box
I
at all,
can.
but okay, perfect.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
feel
Yeah,
free
so
to, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, so Alex, that's a good question. So how do we differentiate them from the Siouans? Like the Mandana Hadassah in particular, that is part of a taxa that we know as the Middle Missouri region. So it's actually really cool that we already see like ancestral differences archaeologically by ancestral Cadoans and ancestral Siouan groups. So Great Oasis has a relationship to that early middle Missouri period. And those are all the ancestral Siouans. There's a lot of conflict going on between initial coalescent variant and initial middle Missouri period. The Ponca and um, Omaha, the Kaw, and those groups in the Iowa, they come out of the Oneota tradition. And so that's discussed more fully in my dissertation to be like it's not that we don't know what those groups are, and Oneota archaeology has been pretty good at identifying who what that is ancestral to. And of course that like that's not to say these people moved through time as a single unit and never intermarried, like what we can start seeing with pottery in particular. There's definitely relationships forming between these groups and people intermarrying. So it's not to say these people just stayed away from each other. There's definitely relationships beyond warfare that are occurring. And I hope that was a succinct answer for you, Alex.
I had a question as well just about the coalescent variants. In Arkansas, at least in my master's thesis studies, we were looking at a coalescent society near the Arkansas River Valley, and the houses were constructed in an extremely similar, almost identical manner. Square-shaped houses with four central posts around a central hearth. However, there were distinct differences between the artifact assemblages within um, or sorry, between the households as well. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how that coalescence in Kansas and that part of the world with the Pawnee traditions kind of either is similar or markedly different from kind of what generally I was seeing in that area in Arkansas.
Absolutely. So I'm like really bad at knowing the ancestral homeland of the Caddo proper. I know they're like very much centralized in Oklahoma at this time, but I'm just not sure how much they got into Arkansas because I know later like the Quapaw and those other Oneota groups end up getting into Arkansas. That is just a record I am so woefully unfamiliar with. What I can speak to with those four with the Central Plains tradition houses, the four main center posts, the central hearth, is the Central Plain tradition itself. Like these aren't towns, these are hamlets. And most likely, even though you'll find three or four houses at a site, they're not dated to the same time. It's as the house dilapidates, they're kind of going through their own cycling, that they're moving up and down river drainages and allowing a fallow period. That coalescence, what we believe really kind of coincides with the medieval warming period. And there's huge drought in Kansas and Nebraska along those tributaries, but the Missouri River is fed by snowpack. And so it's pretty resistant to drought. And so we see people had referred to Nebraska and Kansas being like depopulated, almost a ghost town. But what's happening is actually they're coalescing in northeastern Nebraska, southeastern South Dakota along the Missouri River, and that's where we start actually seeing the formation of those huge towns of like dozens, if not hundreds, of those CPT houses in these fortified towns, and then they become earth lodges over time. So that's kind of really that process, and I'm unsure as to what's going on in Arkansas, but I do know like Spiro and some of those Caddo and Mississippian groups, we do see those like for those same houses, and we do know Spiro is there's Spiroan artifacts that we're seeing in Central Plains assemblage, especially in Kansas. So there definitely is some relationship going on between CPT and their like distantly southern cousins in the Caddo. How that extends into Arkansas, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering too, just about like the artifact assemblages that you're seeing like within the Earth lodges as well. Like are people in those different houses still maintaining like ancestral traditions from their specific group, or are you not able to kind of parse that out, or if you know at all, how that kind of looks?
Yeah. So the ceramic tradition changes. Like at Lynch, like we do see that introduction of Oneota pottery, specifically to design. So they don't really keep the flared rims, but they love those Oneota designs. And all of a sudden, even at Lynch, you'll find like an Oneota style pot, a Central Plain tradition pot, and then a pot in the form of a CPT pot, but with the designs of Oneota. And then from that, when you get to coalescent proper, Pawnee pottery becomes this like rich blend of CPT and Oneota. And I don't think the pots are necessarily representing people, but like very much like this is cool type of thing. Um, so of course the assemblages in the ceramics do change, and with larger populations, you get more diverse um, needs, and so we do see larger pots being created, more elaborate pots. But I mean, like everyone on the plains, like when it comes to the lithic assemblage, everyone from like Canada to Texas adopts plain side notches. Like corner notch points go by the wayside. The basal stuff that's kind of Mississippian's gone. Everyone makes the same point. Um, and that's really when bow and arrow technology, especially when horses come in, just kind of adopts, and that seems to be the most efficient point. We still see the fish hooks and some of the, and pipes make a huge appearance. Catlinite pipes become pretty big. So we do see vestiges of that ancestral CPT stuff going on, but things have just become so much more diverse with especially in the 1500s after folks across the Missouri River drainage in Mississippi become reconnecting after that post-Mississippian period. Everyone's going through a new ethnogenesis, and then trade is kicking off again more fully right before Spanish contact.
Very cool. I'll have to look more into that. That sounds interesting with the decorations and then the forms kind of coming together in different unique ways. So very
Of course,
cool.
and a
Thank
really good book I'd recommend,
you. Mhm.
especially if you have access to like Arkansas libraries, is Archaeology of North America's Great Plains by Doug Manforth, my advisor. He wrote the whole volume, had been done since Waddle Wadle in like the 70s. And he talks a lot about this stuff, and he has some amazing illustrations and talks, because me and him worked on CPT and ICV. There's a lot of focus on that, and there's some fantastic illustrations of that record, and that's present in that volume.
Sweet. I'll add it to my reading list. That's awesome. Thank
Excellent.
you. All right. Any other final questions from anybody? Okay. Well, uh, Dr. Gover, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. And if anyone has any additional questions, obviously he's left his email there for you guys to bother him, but not for the next couple days because he will be busy. So don't bother him until later. But
I will
th
check my email next week. Yeah, I'm heading out on
yes,
some research tomorrow, so I'll be away. But happy to answer any questions. Love to form partnerships with Arkansas in any way that I can. And just shoot me an email.
thank you so much. And good luck with your research over the next week or so, and into the summer too at the field school. That sounds super exciting. So we're glad to have you and have a good night, everybody, and don't go to sleep yet. I mean, it's only 7:30, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Y'all have a good night. Bye.